Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you all for being here. Today, we're lucky enough to get to speak with Charlie Fish, the author of the short story anthology, The Man Who Married Himself, and not just the author of the short story anthology. I feel like within the indie realm, you really are written in lore at this point, whether it be board games, movies, the the man just the website you work on. I think the whole thing is just absolutely incredible, and I think The Man Who Married Himself is a huge testament to that, because when I started it, I really couldn't put it down, and I think I shared the same sentiment as a lot of people of I don't read that many short stories, but especially just how wide ranging the genres and the stories were within The Man Who Married Himself. I didn't think it would be so difficult to put down. And I was reading it on the tube. I was reading it while I was out and about. I was bringing it with me for the 24 hours that I had until I finished it. And it was just hats off to you. You really wrote a wonderful story or a collection thereof.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that's very flattering. I mean, as much as I published the short story collection, actually don't recommend reading short stories back to back to back like that because, a good short story, you want it to sit with you for a bit. So, I read a lot of short stories, so, I'm not following my own advice. Like you said, I run the literary magazine Fiction on the Web, and for that, I have to read, well, I mean, usually at least 3 or 4 short stories every day to keep up with the submissions that I'm getting and decide which ones I'm going to publish on the website. So yeah, I'm not following my own advice, but but yeah, ideally you would pick up a book like that. You'd flick through the titles, pick one that appeals to you, read it, and then give it some time to kind of sit with you. Was there one that you found that did stick with you? Was there a favorite?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I mean, there was a lot of favorites. I think what made it so impactful was that, like you said, they were all hard hitting. And I remember, like you said, I probably shouldn't have read this as a novel, but as I did, when I did finally finish it, I was like, I need to process everything that I just read. There was the one, I believe it was called Remission.
Hmm.
I need to go through. I've got the story here. I need to go through
That's
it.
the science fiction one where he gets sent off to mine
Yeah.
a space moon.
Where
Um,
he basically leaves his life behind, and then but it's this weird, because he's coming back, but he's coming back in so long. Like, how do you carry forward with life? Do you just pretend it doesn't exist? And it was a very intense kind of emotional drama there. I really, really, that one stuck with me for sure.
well, that one because I mean you'll know because you read it, but I have a little blurb about why I wrote each of the stories at the end of the stories.
Mhm.
Um, uh, uh, but that one I wrote as a kind of metaphor for some of the less often explored sides of having a serious illness, the kind of isolation, loneliness, and feeling like the rest of the world is getting on with it, and your friends and family are getting on with it without you, and meanwhile you're kind of stuck in this limbo until you get better, hopefully. And also at the time I was writing it, my own daughter was really, really ill in intensive care. So yeah, I feel like some of that kind of trauma and desperate hopefulness made its way into the story as well. She's better now.
I was just going to ask. I was like, "Oh, please tell me she's okay now, man." The I really love the little blurbs at the end of the stories.
Hmm.
Just reading, especially see the one about when you've been fired from your work. So you wrote, what was it called? How to Get Anything That You Want.
Yes, yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, firstly, because I worked in sales for like 2 weeks, and so much of the first part of that really resonated. I was like, oh, I've heard a pitch exactly like this. But then knowing that it was a kind of almost true story at the end made me giggle. I was surprised by how many of these things, because one of the first notes that I made was, I need to ask Charlie where like the genesis of his ideas comes from, because these feel so weird and original, but grounded in reality. They seem like personal thoughts sometimes. And then I think I counted, like there's a dream in there where it come from. There's a time that you got fired. There were so many different places that it comes from. Is there is there any limit to where like you'll pull an idea from?
Well, I mean, the nice thing about that story collection is it's like a greatest hits collection. I mean, the downside of that is that there's not really one theme that runs through all of the different short stories. They're very eclectic. They're a bit random. Um, but it's because, you know, over the course of the last 20 plus years, I've been writing short stories and getting them published here and there, and, you know, writing a lot of less successful ones as well. But it was long an ambition of mine to consolidate all of the stories that had been successful, that had been published, or that I was proud of, into one place, so that I could show people, you know, this is me, and, you know, use that collection as a kind of business card. Um, but yeah, I mean, that what that means is that these stories cover quite a vast range of time and quite a vast range of topics, because, you know, that
Yeah.
collection wasn't uh, it wasn't put together with one kind of overarching theme in mind.
No,
Yeah, it's a greatest hits.
well, and I think it's, I guess what I wanted to get at was just exactly that. As it is a greatest hits, there are some phenomenal ones here, and we know that you've written other stories. I think for me, there was the instance of, because it isn't just greatest hits over a specific period of time, it's greatest hits over throughout the course of your life, and you could kind of tell, like, you go through the stories like Baggio, and I knew a bit about the story of like the footballer growing up, so it was incredibly interesting to see that philosophical take on everything as well. And I guess where I'm going with this is that the idea that it can range so highly and just really depends on your mood or the day. When you get an idea, do you feel like it has to be written? Like, do you have a notepad with you? Do you use the notes app on your phone? Because some of these feel a lot more spontaneous than others, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, well, the Baggio story, of course, you know, is indirectly inspired by the footballer Roberto Baggio, but actually, I don't know anything about the footballer. You know, as it says in the blurb at the end, it's secretly a story about a badger puppet that my friend had, and my friend infused this puppet with the personality of, I guess, Baggio, this very kind of full of himself and accomplished and kind of slightly arrogant character. But I was so kind of fascinated by the character that my friend had created with this badger puppet, that I wanted to turn that into a story. Um, uh, but your question, your question is not about that. What was your question about? Remind me.
Apologies, apologies. It was more like, how do you kind of keep record of this? How do you organize your thoughts? Because I know, since there's such wide ranging topics, is it the case of once
Yeah.
the idea hits, it has to be written and everything else gets pushed aside, or?
Well, I find that ideas for stories come to me in two different ways. There might be an idea that I think of, and I will immediately sit down and write that story, and then, you know, sometimes that's a real spark of inspiration, and that spontaneity leads to something really great, and I can kind of refine and edit it from there, and it's done all very quickly. But actually, I would say more often than that, I have ideas all the time that are kind of stewing and baking in my head, and um, there are some that I forget about, but there are some that just will not go away, and I keep kind of processing them over sometimes a long period of time, until eventually I think of like a particular angle of attack, or, you know, I synthesize that idea with something else in my head, and then I'm like, yes, that's how I can tell that story. That's how I can write it. And then, you know, that's a much more kind of thoughtful process, and generally take longer to write those kind of stories as well.
I always
Um,
feel a little bit like a hunter gatherer or something. I've got notes files that are just ancient, going way back to early stories that I'd written. And every now and then you'll pull something out. You go reading through it again, and you'll pull something
yeah,
out. And it's funny because it also serves an almost biographical purpose. You go back to an idea that you had 4 or 5 years ago, and you'll remember where you were and what you were doing when you had it. You'll remember what it was that inspired it or what made you think of it. And like you said, it's often not completely formed ideas. It might be a scene or an idea for something or a character that finds its home somewhere else. It really feels like going out like hunting for little, like what should be slotting in here. And the
Yeah, I
synthesis,
mean,
like you said, I love doing that. Yeah.
an example of a story that was in that category, like an idea that was stewing in my head for a really long time, in the collection, is The Cut. I learned about FGM, female genital mutilation, which is a
Yeah.
horrifying topic. And the more I read about it, the more kind of disgusted and shocked and horrified I was. Not only that this practice happens at all, but that it even happens in our own country. And and uh, and I felt really strongly that, you know, I mean, there's a lot that is wrong with the world. The world is on fire, and one of the ways that I kind of deal with the kind of trauma and upset that that causes me often is to write a story about it, because, you know, it's one way that I can kind of capture those feelings and communicate those feelings in a way that makes me feel slightly less helpless. I don't know. And so I knew I wanted to write a story about FGM, but um, I had thought about the idea of switching genders, because I wanted men in particular to kind of feel the pain. And but it took me a really long time, you know, of that idea of switching the genders and telling an FGM story stewing at the back of my head before I kind of found a way of telling that story, an angle that allowed me to approach that story. And I think ultimately I read someone else's short story that was about something else entirely. It was about dragons, and it was like a fantasy story, but there was a particular scene in it, some kind of rite or ritual, that I thought, okay, yes, actually that's the angle through which I can tell this story. You know, the whole idea of FGM, you know, for the people that do it, it's kind of sacred. It's like a rite. It's a coming of age. It's a process into adulthood. And actually, to try to see that point of view and to be sympathetic to that point of view in the story, even though the main character absolutely is not okay with it, it gave me an angle from which to tell the story. And then I sat down and wrote it. And I think, you know, and I'm really proud of the outcome. I think it's a really powerful story.
Yeah, it's a great story, man. I really loved that one. Very disturbing, but there was a lot of subtly disturbing ones. I think from the first line, from the opening line of the book, which I think is something like, "It's a hot summer day and I hate my wife."
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, this isn't afraid to go there." You know, there's a lot of like sex and gore and stuff, and well, not gore, but you know what I mean. In the book, it doesn't really pull the punches, despite the actual titular story. You know, the man who married it himself, compared to the other ones, is almost a little whimsical, a kind of comedic aspect to it and stuff. You know, it's a really interesting story. But yeah, there's such a broad range in there. I'd made a little. Yeah, on you go.
No, I was going to say, I feel like humor is a fantastic way of you know, getting people's guard down. So if I can tell a story with humor, then I will try to, because, you know, people are giggling and that opens them up. And then you hit them with the real meaning of the story, the real message of the story. It gets in deeper than it would if you were framing it seriously or framing it as, like, you know, a somber story.
And I think adding to that, like, when we go back to the idea that so many of these stories are hard hitting, like, you're touching on some incredibly intense topics, like whether it be female genital mutilation, or whether it be, I guess the one that always stuck out to me was the idea of like freedom, like, what's it called? Freedom, will,
That's Baggio's
That's
story,
the one where
giving up free will.
for free will, but you also touch on that in, I believe it's called Cora.
Oh, Cora, yeah, of
Where
course,
she has, where essentially she has too much free will, and she's looking for a way to limit herself in that regard, because having too many decisions or too many options makes it harder to make a decision. I found that incredibly interesting as well. It's like you're kind of lulling us into a way to teach us and show us such frankly important topics. I think that that was really, really well done throughout the stories.
Thank you.
Of note to the blurb of, is it in the blurb of Korra, where they have like unprotected sex after the party and stuff, and in the blurb it says, some people are upset about this. I feel like if I have to explain it, I've probably failed partly in what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I don't know who needed that one explained. I thought it was a very kind of clear message it was sending, like it's what they're talking about.
Well,
But
I'm
yeah, I
glad
really
you
like
got it.
that.
You might be the first.
No, I love that story, man. I love them all, to be.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stories that I published on a website called East of the Web, which
Right.
I absolutely love that website. I mean, it used to kind of loom large for me, and I think it's still going. And I was some of the stories that I published there kind of got a lot of attention and momentum, and that really kind of boosted me early on because one of the nice things about writing short stories as opposed to novel is that the gap between idea and validation is so much shorter. And so it kind of keeps you going, it keeps you prompting you to go ahead. You mentioned, Steve, about the story, your kind of notes, revisiting your notes,
Yeah.
and being a kind of biographical journey. And certainly for these short stories, they cover more than 20 years of my life. And there's a lot of biographical stuff in there. And yeah, they're sometimes exploring extreme themes like sex and death and freedom and stuff like that. But they are often exploring them through the lens of where I was at the time.
Yeah.
Not that these characters are me, um, although I did notice, in the process of compiling them, that a lot of my stories seem to be a kind of man on a mission. And so I guess a lot of them are a kind of avatar of me, a representation of me. But then some, that definitely doesn't apply to all of them. Like, the character in The Cut couldn't be more different from me.
I think, see, talking about it being a personal avatar, I'd noted down that you seem at your most comfortable in the first person.
Oh,
And I
100%,
think,
yeah.
yeah, the style that you write in, it comes off so well. It's perfect first person. The voices of the character comes off so well. And I've got a real thing about, like, a real pet peeve about people writing in the wrong perspective for what they're trying to do. Find it all the time in the submissions that we get or books that I find online. Tell me, have you ever tried third person, or was first person just always what you felt natural?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of stories in the collection that are third person, but I definitely have a very strong preference for first person. And I'm not 100% sure why, except that for me, being in the first person feels like often the only way to explore these ideas that I guess it's just part of my style. They kind of require that internal monologue to frame. I guess I'm using that internal monologue to counterpoint what is happening and to create a kind of dramatic irony. Because quite often, what the character is thinking and what is really happening are completely at odds with each other, and that's not apparent to the character, but it's very apparent to the reader, and that's what creates some of the conflict and drama in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. I think that's a pretty good reason. The other thing that occurred to me for writing in first person, I think you do this pretty well, is that almost all the stories are grounded in some kind of human experience that almost all of us have had. And I know, like, resonating with the reader is really a case of, it's that feeling that you get when you're reading some great piece of work and you can feel the author reach out through the screen and just boop on the head, a little from my head to your head. I know what that feels like. You know what that feels like. We're sharing a moment here. That happened pretty much every story. I was like, oh yeah, I know that feel, man. I think in first person you get right into the human experience itself, as it's being witnessed. It's almost like we're watching the person watching what's going on, like a passenger,
Yeah.
helpless, often like the characters. But I think, yeah,
Well,
I think almost all the stories were that I really vibed with were first person. I like them.
yeah. I guess a lot of my inspiration for a bunch of the stories and my style in general is magical realism. And I probably don't know enough as much as I should about the whole kind of magical realism movement, but you know, some of the it's a style of writing that came out of South America, and I've read a bunch of short stories in particular in that genre of magical realism. But the idea of presenting a very kind of realistic world in a very kind of matter of fact and straight faced way, but something is different, odd. Um, None of the characters in the story acknowledge this. It's just how it is. But that's kind of that's what creates the story, and I absolutely love that. And I guess that's another thing. First person really facilitates that because it allows you to ask that question. You know, in a world which is just like our world, but you know this one thing is different. You know, a character decides to give up his free will, or you know, there's a magic Scrabble board that fulfills prophecies or whatever. Then how would I react? How would that impact a completely ordinary character in a completely ordinary world?
And
But it's, you know, the characters, of course, never see these differences. That is their world.
no, and I completely agree with that because I think a lot of times when you read short stories, they might be in mystical lands or in this or in that. Like there's a lot of world building behind it. But I think the fact that you chose very contemporary settings for all of these made it a lot more relatable. So you didn't have to spend a lot of time setting the scene because
Mm.
we've all experienced it. Like, yes, I've never experienced a Scrabble board that does XYZ, but I've played Scrabble. I know what playing Monopoly is like when it gets too intense. I know what like playing board games are like and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really cool that especially board games make quite a few appearances throughout the story.
Yeah, there's
And
three, aren't there? There's Go and there's a Monopoly story, and
Monopoly
there's
and
the
then
Scrabble
Scrabble
story.
as
Yeah.
well. And I know you have a bit of a history with board games as well. Has that always kind of been the case, or like did any of these ever feel forced because you wanted to talk about board games, or the ideas just kind of float around them?
Well, I mean, I absolutely love board games. I'm obsessed with them. I have an enormous collection and spend far too much time playing them. Um, and uh, and inevitably, that's kind of seeped into the stories I write. And Death by Scrabble is by far my kind of most successful story in terms of the number of people who have read it and the number of people who have adapted it and translated it and where it's been published. You know, the Death by Scrabble really seems to strike a chord with people. And the other two stories in that collection are much kind of more minor stories, lesser stories. Um, but because I've got that love of board games. They're very personal to me, and so I wanted to include them in the collection, even if maybe they didn't reach the same kind of lofty levels as some of the other stories in there. So yeah, in that sense, there was a bit of bias in which stories I chose to be part of the collection.
Mhm.
Um, but but it's not. It's not a forced thing for me to include board games in the stories I write because that's just part of my milieu, you know.
I think when it comes to writing, and obviously this is, I apologize in advance for this question. Do you have favorites here?
In the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are stories that um even now I reread them and you know I get emotional and I'm welling up. And I don't know if they have the same effect on other people because for me they're so personal.
Yeah.
But just somehow I managed to capture, you know, a a, a feeling or a moment in my past well enough that it affects me still when I reread it now. And like an example of that is Killing Mildred. Um, It's a story where the character is working in an old people's home, and one of the residents uh, dies, and that this is their first experience of death. And the tone of the story is kind of comical, as many of them in the collection are. But the when it gets to the emotional bit at the end, um, it's much more kind of, I guess, straight faced and I hope emotionally impactful. For me, definitely emotionally impactful, because um, that I mean, it's not fact, it is fiction, but I worked in an old people's home. I saw some of the residents dying while I was working there, and that character is very much a kind of projection of me. Not all of the characters in those stories are, but that one definitely is. And the ones, I guess, where the characters are a projection of me end up being my favorite stories, because they're the ones that I still feel, every time I read them, I'm still getting that emotional impact off them.
No, of course. And I can only imagine. I think that's part of why, well, this story, the man who married himself, the collection itself was so unique. And I think also adding to what Steve said earlier, the fact that you added those little blurbs at the end of the story, it made it so much more personal, because it felt like we were speaking to the author throughout the story. So we knew that these were your stories, and we knew that you had the inspiration behind them and everything. But the fact that you kind of laid it out for us of, hey, this is where I was at when I was writing this, or this is the main idea behind it. Like,
Mm.
okay, I know what you mean with chorus. Sometimes if you have to explain it, it might not be working as well. But the reality is that it made it such a more impactful experience for the reader, because at least from my experience, it felt like you were kind of there at moments, which was really, I guess, reassuring as well.
Yeah, well, one of the really nice things about self-publishing, I mean, actually, I think it's very, very hard in the UK, less so in the USA. It's very, very hard to get a collection of short stories published, and basically impossible unless you're following it up with a novel. And at the moment, I kind of don't really have any interest in writing novels. I'm all about short stories. I think that they're great and that they're an undervalued medium in the UK, especially. Um, but one of the really nice things about self-publishing is that I could do with the collection what I wanted to do. Like, I'm not sure that a publisher would have been happy for me to include those kind of very personal blurbs at the end of the story. Like, it's an indulgence. Or even the illustrations that I put in for the stories, which are, fantastic, absolutely amazing work of a British illustrator called Yvette Gilbert.
Mhm.
And I worked with her over a series of many months to create those illustrations. I don't think any publisher would have given me that time or that indulgence. So it's really nice to be able to, as an artifact of self-publishing, to be able to create it exactly the way that I wanted and to include the stories I wanted. And I'm not intending to make money off this book. Like I said, it is a business card. It is a representation of me as a writer, and it is a way of I'm giving to people something that communicates who I am and what I've done for the last 20 years.
No, and I think it's entirely that. I can definitely see some of these stories hitting hiccups along the traditionally published route. um, and that's part of why we're here, and it's part of why we try to elevate these kinds of stories. When it comes down to the actual artwork itself, like, I think this is something Steve and I talked about, just the idea of they're so well fitting of the stories, and it makes sense that it took so long to get them right. Do you mind uh I would love to get the artist contact. We'd love to, because when we put this online, we want to add all the details. We want to make sure that people have access to them as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, her name is Yvette Gilbert, and I can share her contact details with you afterwards. But I'm sure if you Google that name, you'll find it. I'm just looking for a chat so I can stick it in there. Is there a chat on this thing?
Oh, there should be. Yeah, next to the React button.
Chat. Oh yeah. Okay. So I just put her name in there so that you know who to search for.
Amazing. And then on another note, we have about 5 minutes left in the call. and we want to ask so many questions. I
Can I get one in? Can I get one?
Please go, Steve, go.
So I couldn't let this opportunity slide to talk to you about curatorship, because my job at Your Paper Quest is to curate books. I get loads and loads of stories sent to me. All my time is spent reading like the first couple of chapters to get a sense of whether this will work or not. And over time, I've really refined the process down quite a bit. You obviously do a lot of curatorship yourself as well. How's your process changed for finding what goes on the site, what doesn't? What do you look for? Have you narrowed it down at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, I've been running fiction on the web for 28 years, publishing. I've published something like 1,800 stories on the website over that time, and I'm currently getting 3 or 4 submissions every single day, and it's a real kind of privileged position to be able to be an authority on selecting which stories are worthy of elevation and which ones aren't. And I'm very often finding myself in situations where I'm turning down good stories because there's just too many. But the plus side of that is that the ones that I'm picking, I feel that they're really, really deserving. I feel like they're really good. And I also, it's my choice, which is a fantastic position to be in, because I am sometimes picking stories that I'm sure no one else would pick. They appeal to me, and I can tell you why. But then, people comment on the stories on the website after they're published. Sometimes they don't seem to appeal to everybody, but I know why I like them, and I get to tell the author why I like them, and I get to be the person that gives them a platform and gives them a boost, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, for you doing this, you're reading novels. I can't, there's so much to read with short stories. I can't imagine how you get through that many novels. It must have been very different for you to be reading short story collections.
Yeah, it was a nice break, to be honest. But usually you might find this yourself pretty quickly into a story. You can tell whether the author's got something of substance that they're really doing, or whether this is, there's a lot of stories out there that are otherwise great, but they're kind of clumsy, or they're technically not great, or there's something missing. There's a little bit of polish and shine missing from it, or a bit of pizzazz.
Yeah.
And usually with them, I can go, right, well, that's okay. I'll just pass that. So the vast majority of them don't make it through the first round of culling. But the ones after that do, I've narrowed it down to writing that is efficient and evocative. And if you've got that, then it's just a matter of telling a good story now. But usually I can trust an author.
Actually, it's interesting that you use the word creator, because I'm definitely a creator more than I am an editor. I'm absolutely a curator, because I mean, I'm often picking stories that are really good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that were actually finished. Like, if I had all the time in the world, I would love to sit down and spend time editing these stories and giving them that extra kind of help to get them to a really fantastic place. I have a lot of opinions about short stories, having read 10,000 of them, and I would love to kind of put that knowledge to work to help authors, but don't have time. So
yeah. Okay, well, we're on our final minute, so I'll let Ryan do his.
I hate to do this to you guys. We have 1 minute and 9 seconds left. So for those of you who are interested, who loved The Man Who Married Himself, what should they do, Charlie? How should they get more short stories? Where should they go?
Well, Fiction on the Web has a Patreon site, patreon.com/charliefish. And that is an opportunity for people to support the site, and you can support it financially. You can also join for free. And I put a monthly newsletter out on there, and that has loads of kind of behind the scenes stuff. It has what I'm doing, if I'm ever getting any short stories published. It's got loads of kind of bonus extra content, audiobooks. So absolutely, you should go and join.
I'm sorry, I gotta cut you off there. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks again. The Man Who Married Himself by Charlie Fish.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye.
Oh, we might have another second.